Now. I see some people popping in. Hello, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give it just probably like one more minute. People are going to be trickling in, but I want to make sure that we can give our panelists as much time as possible to start the discussion because we've got a lot of great things to cover today. So thank you again for everyone hopping on this early Tuesday morning. So I'll go ahead and just start with a little bit of intro and a hello while people are hopping on and getting ready. So I just want to say, start off by saying welcome to the San Diego Green Building Council's Equity Summit that will be running throughout the day today. We're kicking off our morning with the first session of 3. This session is going to be transforming the workplace for a more just future. And we have a really excellent panel of speakers that I'll introduce in just a moment that are definitely eager to get some conversation started. And it's sure to be a really informative way and a kind of a wake up for the morning. So I'm excited to host this. Let's see. So just to start off again, my name is Bridget Rickman. I'm the Community and Programs Manager for the San Diego Green Building Council. We're the hosts of today's summit. We've got a lot of great speakers, 3 different sessions. We are a local nonprofit focused on delivering sustainability and green building education to the San Diego region. And if you're interested in learning more about us, you can visit our website there below. But we have 4 different key educational pillars that we like to address with our education, and that's decarbonization, water reuse, health and wellness, and equity. And no doubt multiple of those pillars will be addressed today, and we certainly want to keep delivering education that's intersectional between all those different key topics. A little bit of housekeeping for today. Again, this is a little bit of an overview of today's summit schedule. When you RSVP'd, you should have gotten links for all 3 of these sessions. There will be a little bit of time for a lunch break in the middle as well. And then we also got links sent out in a reminder this morning. You should have received in an email from me as well. Currently, we have the chat disabled, so if you have any questions, please drop that into the Q&A. There will be a portion at the end where we'll have some time for questions, and I believe our moderator is going to make sure that we address some questions real time to our panelists today as well. And then again, we're recording this right now, so we are hoping we're going to make this accessible to you on our website afterwards. So we'll make sure that we have this, the recordings linked onto our resources page, and I'll send all the attendees a reminder when that information is up and available. Okay, so before we step into some of the content today, I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that I am currently sitting on the traditional and unceded land of the Kumeyaay Nation. And if you're located in San Diego, you might also be on Kumeyaay land, but it's great to take a moment and recognize where you're located and what traditional land you are seated on, especially as we begin conversations on sustainability, equity, and the built environment. It's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards and protectors of our land, often the first defense against climate change. And they continue to fight these fights as development and continued colonialization is affecting their ancestral and sacred lands. So I think it's important to keep in mind as we continue with these discussions. So with that, I'm going to give the time back over to our panelists. I'll go ahead and introduce our 4 speakers today and then let them have the floor. So our moderator for today's discussion is going to be Dr. Hei-ock Kim. I'll give Hei-ock a second to introduce herself.
Hi, Bridget. Thanks for having me as part of this really integral conversation. It's great to be here this morning. I am the Executive Director and founder of the Kim Center for Social Balance. We are a San Diego nonprofit focused on achieving and accelerating the achievement of equal status for all genders in the workplace. And I will talk a little more about the Kim Center later on.
Great, thank you, Hei-ock. Stacey?
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, everyone, and greetings. I hope everyone is doing well. It is a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I am Stacey Barkley, Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leader at DPR Construction, relatively new to the construction industry, just over a year. But prior to that, 12 years in the medical device industry, and before that, behavioral health. All with roles really focused on visibility, access, and resources to underrepresented and marginalized communities. So again, thank you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, Stacey. Next we have Dan.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Bridget, for having me on the panel. My name's Dan Brown. I'm an architect at Gensler. I'm also the one of the design resilience leaders for the San Diego office and a member of the Southwest Regional Race Diversity Inclusive Initiative team. So much like Stacey prefaced, I'm really looking forward to the conversation and jumping in.
Great, thank you, Dan. And then Kanika.
Hi, everyone. I'm also super excited to be here and just get started with our discussion. My name is Kanika Sharma. I'm the Senior Sustainability Consultant for Integral Southern California offices, so that's Los Angeles and San Diego. And I also work along with some wonderful colleagues of mine on our initiative that we launched earlier this year in June called the Anti-Racism Task Force, where we are hoping to move our company not just towards the deep green engineering side, but how do we make the company a deep green and equitable engineering firm moving forward for all of our employees and set an example for the engineering community. So super looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you, Kanika. And with that, I'll pass it over to Hei-ock to start our discussion for the day. Thank you.
Needed to unmute myself. Thanks, Bridget. Just a few words about the Kim Center. As I mentioned, our mission is to accelerate the achievement of equal status for all genders in the workplace. We do especially emphasize women at multiple intersections because they are the largest marginalized group in every population. And most importantly, the only group whose equitable treatment actually benefits all other groups, whether it's gender, race/ethnicity, or sexual orientation, etc. It's a kind of a superpower, and it impacts companies and regions too. Companies with more equitable environments see 15% at least more profit than their competitors and are more resilient to crisis. Key factors include better retention, fewer discrimination lawsuits, higher employee innovative mindset and productivity. Communities also become more resilient to crisis and experience greater economic viability. In fact, workplace gender equity could be the key to economic recovery from the pandemic recession. McKinsey reported that San Diego County alone could increase its GDP by $23 billion, that's billion, within 10 years of achieving workplace gender equity. So to tell you a little bit about us, the Kim Center's signature Gender Leap initiative is focused on systems change. We use 3 tools to generate data and strategies that help leaders accelerate their progress and stay accountable to long-term metrics, which has been missing from the landscape. Right now, there are only a few data points that have been consistently tracked over the decades. We partnered with UC San Diego to develop a comprehensive assessment as our first tool, because you have to know where you are and where you want to go before deciding how to get there. The assessment tracks each company's most significant cultural and logistical barriers to workplace workplace equity by combining company level statistics with employee feedback. It also demonstrates a clear correlation to bottom line growth, which is very, very important for decision makers. Our second tool is a customizable playbook that we co-design with our clients to shorten time to impact by prescribing roles, goals, and timelines for all stakeholder groups. And this could include, or this does include, leaders and employers and, maybe even customers. Finally, our national accreditation holds all employers accountable to the same standards. This means they can self-identify to individual and business mission advocates anywhere in the country. Like women-owned small business federal contracting, for example, this can give them preferred vendor status. So as you can see, Gender Leap is a fully integrated program based on measurable progress and collaborative effort, like a national fitness program for workplace equity. We work with companies, industries, and regions. We help them balance their leadership representation, understand the forces behind their pay gaps, improve their policies, and more. But our most exciting work is giving their employees a voice so that leaders can create rewarding environments for everyone. This includes bringing damaging biases into the light and identifying how to build the strongest support systems for career advancement. So today I'm excited to have 3 panelists share how their companies are also taking the intentional data-driven approach to make real change in industries that are historically lacking in gender and racial equity. My first question is for Stacee. Fewer than 10% of employees in the entire construction industry are Black. Fewer than 10% of construction employees are women. This means the number of women in the industry who exist at all intersections of marginalization is even smaller. You mentioned that you started at DPR about a year ago. What kind of challenges did you see? And how did you identify where to start?
Well, thank you, Hei-ock. It's interesting, and this is not specific to DPR. It really is a general recognition across the industry that there's underrepresentation of women and various ethnic groups. And so I think part of it was just acknowledging the workforce shortages that exist today and the ones we actually are anticipating in the future, and realizing that there needs to be a more compelling value proposition for careers in the construction industry, and that we need to be really intentional and focused on access to more diverse communities. So again, being very targeted in terms of adding HBCUs to campus portfolio recruiting activities, going to diverse professional associations like the Society of Women Engineers, National Society of Black Engineers, et cetera. So it really was stepping back and recognizing the opportunities that exist, and then really just pivoting our attention to be really focused on those underrepresented communities. I think you're on mute.
You're muted again.
Too many things. Daniel, people often attribute the underrepresentation of people of color in architecture to factors like few role models or little exposure to the industry and financial considerations. Women of color face a double whammy. About half of architecture graduates are in fact women, but they comprise a minority of licensed architects and less than 20% of principals or partners. What are some of Gensler's strategies to improve the racial and gender balance?
Yeah, Gensler is the world's largest architecture firm, definitely plays a significant role in addressing what you just lined out. On the subject of race, in this last year, we rolled out a comprehensive plan regarding race, diversity, and inclusion. That's really a multifaceted approach that includes increasing racial diversity, the pursuit of equitable design solutions, creating job opportunities, and partnering with our clients on diversity and inclusion. I think from a macro scale standpoint, looking at those sort of 5 key points and factors, it's going to be an evolution through time to sort of source and develop the talent pool that can be placed in a leadership or acknowledged into a leadership role for the firm in the future. On the subject of gender, like you just described, I think that it's a matter of creating a empathetic and a open work environment where candid conversations can be had, where the realities of the dynamics of work for women and the dynamics of work for every employee are recognized, and a true open conversation can be had between employers and employees, and where some of the things that you just described in terms of the behaviors that have sort of plagued the industry previously are addressed and openly discussed and acknowledged moving forward.
Thank you. Kanika, less than half of mechanical engineers are women across all races and ethnicities. More than architecture, engineering does in fact have a pipeline issue for both racial and gender, and especially at the intersection. Are there cultural barriers that you think are unique to the engineering industry, and are you seeing any significant evolution?
Thanks, Hei-ock. So yeah, you outlined some of the questions that we started to ask in generally when we were working on our CSCR reporting and gathering all of that data from our employees. And these cultural barriers that you mentioned, I mean, they start, in my opinion, start at a very early age. Engineering is intrinsically, like construction, considered a male-dominated field. And I feel like we don't encourage the women or the young girls enough to move into these fields. And that, I think, needs to be addressed. And so for us, part of the initiatives that we are working on is to help volunteer with organizations like Scientific Adventures for Girls or other similar organizations, Women Who Code, to get them enrolled in these professions and inspire them to enter into the STEM fields from a very early stage. And then I feel like even when women enter the workforce, there is significant data from the Society of Women Engineers that show that 30% of the women leave the workforce after entering the engineering field due to organizational climate challenges, and they don't feel invited, or they don't feel like they are part of the organization. So how can we work towards having efficient retention policies of women who have already entered the workforce and are working in the field and feel like they are a part of the culture of the overall organization, are things that we are working on. But to drive all of that, like you said, or like Stacey said, data is the key for us. And we've been trying to gather as much data through our CSER surveys and through just, employee conversations to gauge where they want Integral to work towards, and how do they see what is their vision of that equitable firm for them. So that's what we're working on right now.
Thank you, Kanika. Stacey, what would you say are the primary groups of concern? And please feel free to speak from the perspective of intersectionality, either at DPR or in the construction industry as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's important to note that diversity, equity, and inclusion really is about everyone. It's about everyone and for everyone. I think oftentimes when we approach these conversations, we do segment, and it's important to identify, again, underrepresented and marginalized groups so that we can lift everyone up. But as the quote goes, women's issues are human rights issues, right? And so it's one of those things, if we build everyone up, then we're all really successful. So I think it's about building a culture of inclusion and belonging where people feel like they have a voice. That voice matters. They're contributing to, at DPR, we say building great things. And so it's a holistic approach to that. And so it's a kind of think global, act local proposition. And looking at it through an industry lens, it's approaching it across the entire life cycle of an employee. So everything from the time they're first introduced to the organization, until they hopefully have a long and happy and fulfilling career and do something else moving forward. But it really is that the overarching strategy is about how we embed diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything we do, how we get work, do work, and ultimately take care of our people. And if you approach it from all of those various inflection points, again, from talent acquisition through offboarding, and recognize opportunities to grow and enhance and lend a voice to every community, we're all better for it. You're on mute.
Sorry, I actually clicked on mute this time. Thank you, Stacey. I wanted to take that kernel you said about how we do work and expand that for Daniel into a question about equitable design solutions for cities and communities. How do you see that evolving either at the moment or hopefully not too long in the future to address their particular needs across intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said evolution, right? And I think it will truly be an evolution, much like Kanika and Stacey acknowledged in the first conversation. We're kind of in the infancy of addressing some of these questions and some of these issues. And it would be naive to believe that we know the answers, or yet alone know all of the questions right now. We're still in the discovery phase of this entire groundswell movement, and making it a movement beyond a moment. So I think that in terms of designing an equitable future, it's truly going to be an evolution. I think not to dive into politics, but I do believe that political engagement from a younger generation will drive policy change and will have a role in policy change. And that policy change then in terms of as it relates to construction and building and design will have an impact on building codes more than likely.
Mhm.
And that those building codes then will shift and drive the actual realities of code implementation on design and construction. So I think that that's definitely going to play a major role in the shaping of future cities. I also think beyond just a political engagement, I think engagement in community planning groups here locally will be a major factor in that as well, because once communities are able to organize and establish their own desires and their own wishes in a way that can influence and inform the development of projects within their community, that will help shape the reality that they're seeking, and play a role in designing equitable solutions for those communities. I think that there are certain policies that have started to take hold. For example, opportunity zoning, which have some promise to them. I think that some of the challenges there, and what a lot of our BIPOC or marginalized communities are facing, is realities of gentrification. And so there's a delicate balance of trying to incentivize development, designing equitable solutions, and ensuring that we're not gentrifying the existing population within those communities. So in a way, we're trying to create this sort of perfect mixture of incentivized development that's non-gentrifying. And much like I said before, I think it's going to continue to be an evolution.
Right, right. Kanika, do you have any comments or thoughts you'd like to share related to this question?
I think one thing that we are strong proponents of, and that is definitely based on the industry evidence that we are seeing on how it affects, marginalized groups, is the issue of electrification. So we know for a fact that residences or buildings that burn natural gas have the children that grow up in those buildings that have 30 to 40 times more cases of asthma related diseases or respiratory diseases. So we as an industry, we as the leaders in this engineering world, are trying to push for electrification on our end, and that I think is one of the major design moves that we are trying to make here and trying to advocate for that. Most of our buildings, like we want them to be net zero energy with all electric buildings. So that I think is like one of the major steps that we are taking within our firm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And at this point, I want to invite the audience to go ahead and ask questions as they come to you if you want to, and we will try to answer them in real time. I would like to give Stacee an opportunity to respond to this question as well from the construction perspective.
Thanks. And so again, data, we kind of go back to that over and over again. And we know that suggests a focus on both gender and BIPOC communities, but I think it goes back to that employee life cycle conversation. And really, when we think from talent acquisition to talent management, promotion, attrition, both voluntary and involuntary, learning and development, pay, I think ultimately the measure of success is how all of these communities, by comparison to their general representation, show up in our respective workforces. And that's when we're thinking about the equity piece. That's ultimately how we look at some degree of measurement of success. Ultimately, it's about lifting up communities, but how those communities show up relative to the overall population is a general indication of success factors.
Thank you. Kanika, going back to you, Integral Group has been publicly reporting on social and environmental responsibility for 3 years now, and most recently with an emphasis on Black Lives Matter and anti-racism. How do you integrate, well, would you like to describe this process? You mentioned that your initiative is relatively new, and how do you integrate the issues of gender and racial equity?
Yeah. Well, it definitely has been a journey for us too. I've only been at Integral for the last 1 year, but I've heard and interacted with Megan White, who is our CSO, and other, folks who have been working on CSER reporting since 2017. And just in the fact of our learning, like through our data, how we've realized that diversity is a metric by which we can measure inclusiveness, and it's not the other way around. And while we are working towards making our company more inclusive, that's what our core focus should be. And so just in the naming and framing of how we have started to collect this data, now we call it our JEDI incentive: justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, rather than just measuring, diversity and equity in the company. And so the focus has now completely shifted to making sure that our firm is welcoming to everyone. We are taking care of everyone. Everyone can show up with their authentic selves to the table, and their voice are heard and counted. So, and also with the data that we have started to collect, a big focus of ours has been on getting our JUST label, which is a social equity label. We were one of the first engineering companies that started to look at the JUST label back in 2013 when ILFI first released it. And at that time, we were just looking at Oakland for that label. But then we wanted to increase and expand our footprint and be a little more global with our data collection and how we are being transparent about the practices that we hold for these two indicators. And so we initiated a global label for our company moving forward. And now we have come at a point where we are working directly with ILFI to inform practices that apply to a global organization like Integral Group for their JUST 2.0 label. And we are actually working with Kelly Baker, who is also a part of this summit. She'll be speaking in the third workshop today. And also Sandy from ILFI, and actively working with them on how we can improve the indicators and the KPIs that are embedded in the core philosophy of that label to move things forward. And you had previously alluded to the fact, we first need data. We first need to be transparent about what our practices are in order to then start to reevaluate and look at what improvements need to be made. And we are at that stage where we have made tremendous strides with the data that we've collected on the gender equity indicator, where we are at 47% women in our company. So that for us is a great achievement. But now the focus is on how can we be more inclusive and include the underrepresented minority groups and start to encourage them to become a part of this firm and work towards their growth and their chart their pathway to mobility, and like how can we encourage them to move up the ladder and become leaders in this space.
Right, the 47% women, I want to kind of marry that fact with what you just said about moving up through the pipeline. So do you see the women as sharing almost equally in terms of leadership, like throughout all the leadership and management positions, as well as throughout all the departments?
So not right now, unfortunately, but like everybody on the panel has also talked about, it is a revolution and it is a journey. I think it starts by acknowledging that, yes, we need to get there, and we are at the stage where we have started to analyze this data and really quantify it, and seeing the numbers of where the gaps are and where we want to be. And our approach for most of our projects is to look at the desired outcome statements. What is the ideal vision for our company, for our industry, where we want to be, and then what are the different steps that we need to get there. So right now we have, I want to say like 3 or 4 women who are in the corporate leadership positions and the managing principals. But then again, like right now we are just talking about the US, but our firm is global. We have representation in multiple other countries, much like TPR and Gensler. And so what are some of the inherent challenges that those countries face culturally, like, not just in the itself, but like I said, from a very young age, how do we start to encourage women and young girls to enter into the STEM field so that they can enter our workforce in countries like Serbia, for example. So that is a constant challenge for us, and we are working with the leaders from those countries while also setting successful case examples in the US that other countries can look at and follow.
Great.
If I could, Hei-ock, I just want to
Oh, yeah,
respond to
please.
Kanika there. And I think what she touched on there is very important. The global nature versus what's happening domestically is an entirely different dynamic conversation, and one that I think most of our companies recognize and one that they're delving into, but it's not a simple solution that is applied universally across every platform, every office. I also think that both with Stacee and Kanika, speaking of data is an amazing tool when it's used properly. And I think that using the data in a way of analyzing where we sit currently is an extremely important step across all of our industries. Where data can become a little bit more dangerous, I think, is when you start to talk about quotas, or you start to talk about here's our targets, versus having real open conversations about what are the desired outcomes, and actually talking about things that you introduced the entire panel discussion on. Is what are the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion on company performance as a whole. So I think that all of us, none of us here are really experts as it relates to diversity and inclusion in all of our respective fields necessarily. I think all of us being open to have these conversations, being open to have this dialogue, is really just the impetus in the beginning of the evolution. And those who are listening in on this call should feel empowered to have these same types of conversations with their leadership. For myself, personally, I recall over this summer when we started seeing all of the sort of tragic and horrific things happening across the country, I directly sent a message to my leadership and asked, what can I do to help? That was the first step of saying, that was before any of the initiatives were set up. That was before any of the goals or metrics or targets were established. It was purely just suggesting to leadership within my current office that I am willing to have a conversation and willing to help, and asking what role can I play. And I think that that's really the beginning that everybody needs to take.
Daniel, that's a perfect segue into my next question, and this is for everybody actually. The issue of allyship. So change really is more than a conversation between leadership and the marginalized groups. It requires the goodwill and participation of all employees. We know what Daniel thinks, and I'm assuming everyone is in a similar boat since you've jumped on to address the issues of equity in the workplace. What are your thoughts and how do you promote this? Stacey, let's start with you.
Thanks, and I'm going to piggyback on a couple of things that Kanika and Daniel said. The data is absolutely critical, and it's got to be used in a really thoughtful and meaningful way. It helps understand where there are opportunities and where gaps exist, and can inform some of the decisions that we make. And the events that have transpired recently have certainly been a catalyst for a lot of companies to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in ways they might not have previously considered. And that's part of why I led with DEI is truly for everyone and about everyone. Everybody's got to be on the journey together in order for us all to make meaningful progress. Specifically as it pertains to allyship, it's so important for people to not only lend their voice, but to be the voice of others. And so that also speaks a little bit to the difference between being a mentor and being a sponsor. The data will tell us that women and people of color are often over-mentored. We have lots of people willing to give amazing advice. What we really need are sponsors, people who are in the room when the doors are closed and the conversations are taking place, advocating on our behalf for those opportunities, those stretch assignments, that promotion. And that's really, so allyship to me, advocacy and sponsorship all go hand in hand, because it really is being willing to lend your voice to add value to someone else's voice. And we can't get from point A to point B without it.
Absolutely. Very, very good points. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of sponsorship, because that is something that people are just starting to understand. And there really is a difference between tons of advice and actually taking someone sort of by the professional hand and leading them through the pipeline and promoting their work to others. Kanika, how would you like to respond to either this or any of the things that have been mentioned?
Well, I think, I am not originally from the United States, as you can tell from my accent. I am born and raised in India. When I came here, I had a very different perception of what the US was, and that was primarily from all of the Hollywood movies that I'd seen. And now being inserted in the culture and understanding how race and, affects every single decision that we make in our industry, in our work, and how that is a conversation that needs to happen. It was a little uncomfortable for me too at the beginning to engage in these conversations. And now I consciously wanted to expand my comfort zone and continue to have these conversations with folks. But I realized through this process is not everybody is on the same page as me. And the experiences that I've had of my growth in India versus the experiences that some folks here have had with issues of racism and exclusion and discrimination are completely different. And most people don't feel comfortable voicing and talking about these issues, especially in the workplace. So I think holding space and giving them an opportunity to speak up on one-on-one conversations. So I've been doing a lot of one-on-one conversations with my peers and trying to understand where they come from and why they do not want to be included in other larger group conversations that the leadership is encouraging, and trying to be the voice for them. And I think this is something that I raised to our leadership, and there have been certain initiatives that now will encourage the smaller employee resources groups, again, smaller groups that would just help benefit, some of the folks who don't want to be engaged in a 50-person work session or, in our anti-racism task force. So being there for the folks who are not there yet in terms of being transparent and open about what they really feel, I think is super critical. And then again, going back on the data, the aspect of data, I feel, to Dan's point, data does start to get dangerous when it's only just like metrics or numbers or goals that we are trying to measure or, get there. Because for most people in our workforce, like, data doesn't really matter that much. It's only a handful of us who are analyzing that data and then making sure that there are policies in place right now in the immediate future and in the long term that help these folks who are, essentially the bones of the organization. And so to help clarify that, I think having initiatives in place that, such as anti-discrimination trainings for all of the leadership, or acknowledging the emotional harassment that many folks here feel in the workplace, and how can we get past that implicit bias that we hold through trainings, and bringing the education, providing that education to everyone in the firm, are some things that we can take right now. Having a fundamentally working human resources department that everybody feels comfortable going to whenever they face an issue of discrimination, those are the things that we can do right now. And that would help improve and make sure that everybody feels included and feels like that they are a part of this team, rather than just them working in isolation, especially with us being virtual, So holding those spaces and having those conversations in smaller groups, whereas also giving them the opportunity to be a part of the larger team through certain initiatives, I think is even more critical right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Stacee, when we were talking earlier and I asked you about measuring progress and equity, you said data, 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 and everybody has been talking about data. And Kanika is very correctly talking about the importance of bringing in the employee voice. What are some ways that you are doing that specifically at DPR?
So we have done really a couple of things. I think, like most organizations, we have historically engaged in surveying our people to really understand where are they at, what's meaningful for them. I think oftentimes we can all get encapsulated in a bubble and think people want a certain thing, but it's important to actually ask what people want. So that's been an ongoing process for us. We're actually getting ready to go into another cycle of surveying, because now it's not just the traditional employee satisfaction or traditional employee engagement surveys. What we're living through now, socially, psychologically, politically, economically, and medically, it really has people operating in a very different state from a wellness perspective. So how people are doing work, engaging in their work. Kanika speaks very eloquently about the inclusion piece, because diversity is just one of the pillars, if you will. It's diversity, equity, inclusion. People have to feel like they belong and are cared for. So it's about a culture of inclusion and belonging, which now goes past some of our other traditional, if you will, measurements that we have historically engaged in. And so I think certainly for us at DPR, it's looking at what's the critical pieces of information we need to know from our people that are going to make a meaningful difference in their lives, versus oftentimes what can be that kind of more hierarchical, view of, oh, well, these are all of the things that will make people feel better. It really is, let's find out what people need, how they can have work-life integration, work-life balance, can function for those that are in roles that allow them to work from home. How can we make that easier for them to do and engage and create safe spaces? So again, I think it's really looking at it. This year, I think, has forced all of us to look very differently than from, if you asked this question a year ago, I probably would have given you a slightly different answer. But I think how people are engaging in work as it's combined with their personal lives more and more. Every time I go on mute, it's because there's a lot of noise happening in the background. We're all working in these very dynamic environments. And so what people need from a work perspective looks very different today than it did historically. And so we really are trying to get the voice of our people to help inform the decisions that we make moving forward.
Excellent. Yeah, at the Kim Center, we use the same principles with our clients. I'm curious, for the folks out there who maybe are just starting to think about an initiative or are wondering how they can develop a strategy, can you suggest 1 or 2 questions, specific questions that you ask your employees to evaluate some of these issues you're talking about? Are you willing to share?
Oh, absolutely. I'm always searching for the button to make sure that I've got it right. Well, and I'm certainly curious, Kanika and Daniel, how they're surveying their folks as well. We are starting to really look at some fundamental questions. How are you doing? What do you need? As opposed to, oftentimes survey questions, you can kind of pepper them in such a way that you're soliciting answers that you think you want. Right. And this really is about creating that gray space for people to be able to free fill. This is what I need. I need some no Zoom afternoons, if you will. I need to be able to start my day at 10 as opposed to 8 because I've got childcare that I now have to accommodate at home. So the way we're approaching our questions, and we actually have a Tiger team that's really looking at the survey format, but it's really a lot around gray space for people to be able to free fill and us not necessarily kind of having these predisposed questions around this versus that, as much as you tell us what would make a meaningful difference in your life to have you feel not only like you're still engaged, that you're a part of our wonderful DPR family, but that we can help kind of offset or augment some of the other things that are happening this year that probably weren't happening last year.
Yeah. Daniel, would you like to also contribute something there?
Yeah, no, I think what Stacey was saying is 100% right. And beyond just the nature of surveying and asking those questions, again, I think Kanika touched on this as well, is really creating in this year what's a virtual safe space, right? Creating a space where open dialogue can be had amongst any individual offices, region, or within the architecture profession, within a studio or a project team, where individuals feel comfortable acknowledging the realities of work flexibility and the dynamics of work in 2020 with what's going on with the global pandemic. Gensler was one of the first firms to institute firm-wide work from home, which was something that happened very swiftly. And with people's needs for childcare, me being a father of 2, it kind of threw everything into a haywire situation where it really came down to having real meaningful conversations within each individual project team of saying what your availabilities are. And that to me really broke down the barriers that were sort of previously instituted and framed around this notion of work. And I think that moving forward beyond 2020, across multiple industries, I think that we'll start to recognize and understand like I said, the dynamics and fluidity of work. And policies will ultimately need to be formed where there's perhaps some type of critical overlap between employees, where there is that sort of critical time for engagement. But the policies are going to adapt and change moving forward.
Thank you. Kanika?
Yeah, I would just 100% agree with both of you. And I would just like to add, it's just so interesting how now I'm seeing some of my colleagues who are also taking care of their children, they block out time on their calendars. It's like childcare. So we know not to schedule meetings around them. And I think it just has to come from the leadership as well, who understand this work-life integration. And then it just, trickles down to all of the team members to let them know that we are okay with you prioritizing your family over your work during certain times of the day, or if you need that space, it's okay. And I feel like in the virtual world, there is a difference between checking in and then over checking to make sure that everybody is working, because we have to be trusting of everyone. We need to trust that everyone is well intentioned and is doing their job, no matter what the distance is between now with this, us being virtual. And then also, lost my train of thought, but there was just one thing that I was going to say. All right, it'll come back to me, but it basically, like, I'm definitely seeing a shift in how we are working together. And it feels really nice that everybody is now comfortable with those boundaries. Oh yeah, I now remember. So we did, in the last month, we've been doing our CSER roadshows and asking everybody around the different initiatives that Integral has. Like in our Diversity Council, we have Health, Happiness and Satisfaction Council and Safety and Resiliency. And one of the big things that we asked people, like, after asking how are you feeling and what do you think would make you feel better working from home, is the popularity of having a policy in place which discourages people from using their emails and cell phones after work hours. And it just is so refreshing to come from like a managing principal that again like trickles down to everyone in the firm with this understanding and philosophy that yes, we are okay with you being just dedicated to your family after work hours, and we don't need you to be on your computer 24/7 answering emails. So that I think like all of these things and encouraging folks to initiate from whichever chair they're sitting on, to be a leader from, to lead from whatever title they hold, I think is like something that really encourages men obviously, but like women also, to become those leaders and champions in the firm in their smaller groups.
Yeah, and that's a great principle that can actually be flipped inside out as well. And in letting employees know that they don't necessarily, if it's conducive to the type of work they do, they don't have to be available during traditional work hours in a very strict way, because perhaps because of family responsibilities or other caregiving responsibilities, they need to be away 2 hours in the middle of the day, but they're going to be working from 10 to midnight or something. And to allow that flexibility opens up a huge market.
And it's also about allowing that trust, right? It's creating that trust
exactly.
with your employee and recognizing, to your point that you made earlier, the intersection between equity and work-life balance, and recognizing the realities of digital burnout and people's, need to feel constantly connected. And like I said earlier, I think that it's going to be an evolution, and more than likely it's going to be something that's going to stick around post-pandemic, right? It's truly a paradigm shift in the way that we're working.
Yeah, and it is great to finally openly blur those lines between family and work and acknowledge that workers are human beings with lives.
Well, and
Daniel,
if I can just piggyback for just a moment,
absolutely.
one of the dynamics that exists in our space is half of our workforce are the amazing people who are actually building buildings. They're actually making those structures come to life. And so the option of being able to do this from home doesn't exist. Or if anybody has ideas on how to make that happen in a virtual world, please let me know. But the reality is we think about frontline workers, essential workers, we are blessed in our space here to be able to do this from our home offices in spite of the noise in the background, when there is most of the population still has to go out every day and provide for themselves and for their families. So when we think about the diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just for kind of our organizations, but when we think really more holistically and more globally, that looks different for different people depending on where you sit. And so it's so important to touch base with everyone in a workforce, regardless of where they sit, to make sure that we really are meeting and addressing those needs, because options that exist for one group, this is the equity piece, may not exist for another just because of the nature of their work. And so it's all the more important to create that culture of inclusion and belonging and wellness, where people have both that psychological as well as physical safety, particularly in today's age.
Thank you, Stacey. And that's actually a good segue into a question that was posed by an audience member. specifically for Daniel, but I think everybody can respond to this. Thanks for talking earlier about voting and broader policy change. I was wondering if you could talk more about your concern about quotas. I think my concern is about tokenism without proper policies to ensure inclusion. But I also think that quotas can help us get to a place where mutual support can help push inclusion. Great question.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think the question kind of touched on an important aspect in itself, right? The idea of quotas as a driver for inclusionary change, but also this notion of tokenism, right? I think that promotion or elevation into leadership within any organization will not be successful if it isn't merit based. And so the reality from my position would be, it's really a matter of providing opportunity, advocacy, mentorship, sort of lobbying behind closed doors, as Stacey put it earlier, for opportunities for underrepresented minority groups within any organization to have the opportunity and elevate to a position of leadership. I think that if it's purely about hitting a quota or hitting a target number and there's no merit behind it, then you'll likely see backlash from employees within the organization in the recognition of it's simply looking at trying to hit a metrics-based, data-driven number.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to throw a statistic in here that when you want to start shifting the tide, you need 30% minimum representation of any population to actually make a difference. So if you're building a leadership team, for example, or a managerial team, you can't pull in one Black trans woman and call it done. You really need to aim for that 30% to influence, as everyone's been saying, not only the numbers, but the culture of acceptance. And then now I would like to turn it over to Kanika for response.
I have not experienced that personally. Like, I have not been in those conversations, so I don't think I am the right person to speak to it.
That's fine. I put you on the spot. Stacey, would you like to respond?
I'm going to hope that my background noise cooperates. So apologies in advance for anything that you might hear. So yeah, I think it's absolutely, Daniel, I think you're right. We have to be really thoughtful about representation. And I think part of it is having everybody understand the business case around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Hei-ock, you spoke to it earlier. The reality is that we know more diverse, inclusive, and engaging teams, they outperform their counterparts. They're more innovative, they're more productive, they make more revenue. The reality is that there's all kinds of data to support why having diverse groups are so important. So I think part of it is just, there's a bit of education that needs to be done, that this is how we perform better. This is how we give back to our communities. This is how our workforces represent the communities in which we live, work, serve, and build. So I think part of it is just the narrative that goes along with it, not just the data or the number or the aspiration that a company may have for a particular group, but why lifting up all of these varying groups is so important. And I want to kind of pivot back a moment on the diversity piece, because we do often focus on gender and BIPOC. But I will say, when we think about diversity, we need to realize the kaleidoscope that exists. So it's LGBTQ+, it's people who are differently abled, it's our veterans. So I also just want to, as people are really looking at their teams, understanding that diversity manifests itself in a number of ways, and that there really is a kaleidoscope effect. And so how we look and build diversity within our organizations might look a little bit different depending on where you sit, and isn't exclusive to any one group, but it's about lifting up all of the underrepresented communities that exist.
Absolutely.
Can I just add to that?
Oh, please, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, so I have not, like when I haven't been engaged in those conversations, it's basically focused on the quota, but like, to Stacey's point and to Dan's point, I think just even the folks who are setting that quota, the diversity, what they represent, and the intentions that they hold behind setting these quotas, I think will definitely inform the direction whether or not this is the right approach for the company as a whole. And for us, like, it is the data that we gather through the CSCR is what informs these decisions, even though I haven't been personally involved in those. But so I guess like I just wanted to make the point that the intentions behind setting that data, setting that quota is also super important when we think about, you know, what is the goal that we are trying to achieve.
And I actually have a question about that goal. How do you determine what your, for example, representation goals are, considering all the different aspects of diversity? Should your staff, your employees, should they represent the general population, or should they represent your clientele? And then should leadership, well, leadership should represent your employees. That's a given, but how do you determine where those lines, is it a moving target, for example?
For us, it always has been what we want to be representative of the local communities and that we represent and the work we are doing in those offices. And to that end, like that also becomes a challenge when we go outside of the United States, because most of our data is on gender and ethnic diversity is based on the census data that is collected like as the baseline data. But there are some countries like Australia where we operate and they don't even ask this question in the census. For them, it's just, do you consider yourself a white or a non-white? So it doesn't distill down into the other ethnic minority groups. And for us to be able to have that baseline, like, is so important for us to then set our targets of how we can be best representative of those local minority groups that we serve. And then also, you mentioned clients. So a part of our thinking has now begun to delve into what are the kind of projects that we want to undertake. Like, do we really want to do prison projects? Do we want to do other projects that are harming the communities that we are trying to elevate and serve? So I think it's an amalgamation of all of those, and we are constantly looking towards how can we think about this holistically in terms of the people that we are serving, the partnerships that we are forming in the industry, the clients that we are taking on, the design practices that we are engaged in, to have an overall positive impact with our services.
Great. I want to give Daniel a chance to respond, but first I want to encourage our audience to ask your questions as they come to you. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to just jump into the conversation. Daniel.
Yeah, no, I think the question you asked is ever evolving, always a moving target, something that is in the midst of transformation currently. And I think, you know, the idea of being reflective of your clientele and being reflective of your community is really hitting at the desire or the goal of true sort of community representation in every field, right? And so we're starting to talk about the real sort of systematic and transformative needs from a societal standpoint. So in the architecture industry in particular, I can say that traditionally to get a license in architecture, you have to attend a NAB accredited school. And then there's multiple years of testing in order to get your board certification through whichever state you're going to register in. And there are barriers to entry within the requirements of pursuing that license. And I think what we're hoping for is that by acknowledging those barriers, by recognizing that we have underrepresented groups that aren't really able to pursue the career based off of its current practices, we can also start to acknowledge and have conversations about alternate methods of achieving that license, right? And we're starting to talk about, again, the true real need of understanding the societal needs of transformation for true representation across multiple platforms and multiple industries.
Yeah. Stacey?
Yeah, so at DPR, we actually have a vision statement as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it is to have a workforce that reflects the diversity of the communities in which we live, work, serve, and build, wherever that may be. So that's certainly going to be regional, geographic. It's going to vary depending on where you sit in the US as well as internationally. And so while I think generally within this space, what companies look at is global gender representation and then US ethnic diversity. And then again, when you go outside of the US, it's going to be somewhat geographically specific. But I think ultimately it is that vision, and Daniel touched on it as well as Kanika, that you really represent where you work, where your employees live. And so I think if you go into that as your intention, then your outcome can become that because you're focused. That said, the data, going back to the data, that there is a piece of it that, yes, we can look at the overall kind of general population numbers, but then you do have to look at workforce demographics. What's the available talent pool within a particular industry? And based on that, you might, again, look at different recruiting mechanisms. Daniel alluded to the barriers to entry based on degree requirements, and how can that be looked at more creatively? I know we're even looking at what roles specifically require degrees versus not a degree. We know that women and people of color are oftentimes underrepresented in certain degree portfolios, and veteran populations are all, you may have an incredible 20-year career in the military and have not opted to go down a traditional college route. And so we have to say, does this role, is it better to have a degree, or is it great to have somebody that's got 20 years of experience that they're bringing to the table? So I think it really is about, when we talk about reflecting our communities, what's the approach that we need to take? And I think it just requires us to be creative and not maybe look at it through some of the historical lenses that some of these careers used to be positioned, and really saying, how do we get access to amazing talent that can contribute to all of our organizations in really gifted ways?
Yeah. We're coming up on our time here. Bridget, did you, I was going to invite everybody to make a closing statement, but do you have final comments you need to close with?
I'll just need a minute or two at the end, but I would love to hear some closing statements from everyone, including yourself, Hei-ock. That'd be great.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, what would you like to tell the audience in terms of where to start, where to hope you can get to, and what to expect? What kinds of broad expectations can you have from starting or increasing the pace of a program?
What I would say to those in the audience is feel empowered. Feel empowered to seize the moment. If you feel a calling to be an agent of change, to make a difference within your organization, pursue it. Reach out to the people that you need to reach out to. Take initiative. Don't hold back. Really take it upon yourself and try and be that change agent. That would be my closing advice.
Great. Same question for you, Kanika.
100% agree with Daniel and would echo that. And add to that, find a mentor, find an ally, find someone who you can trust and have these conversations with, and just hold on to them. And I think keep trying. This is this is gonna take time.
Yeah.
We are enjoying the fruits of the work that the generation prior to us, or the women and the people of color prior to us did, for us to be able to have this conversation, frankly. And so we need to carry that work forward and keep trying every single day. This is not an easy task. It's gonna take time, it's hard, but giving up is not an option.
Absolutely. And research shows that it can take anywhere from 2 to 12 years to see results. But really at that point, at around that decade mark, if not before, you will actually start to see increased stability within whatever community you're working in. Stacey.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say +1 to what everyone has already said, and just piggybacking on what you said specifically, recognizing that this journey, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So it does take time, but everyone, each and every one of us, has an opportunity to make a difference, not only in our lives, but in the lives of someone else. And so I think if you just hold on to that what you do impacts not only you, but the person sitting next to you, or maybe the person you don't even see yet. But people see you, they see what you're doing. You can influence change and be a positive motivator for someone else that you may never even have an opportunity to meet. So just know that it's a marathon, not a sprint, but each and every one of us has an opportunity to make a difference, both in our small circles of space, our companies, but within the broader society. Lend your voice.
Thank you all. Bridget, I would just say that my closing statement is a message to leadership. As Kanika said, this is coming. You might as well get in on the ground floor, so to speak, because it not only is the right thing to do, but it is a question of outcompeting your fellow companies in your industry, as well as across the board. So it has to do with finance, it has to do with economic advantage, as well as social advantage. And if you, as all our panelists were talking about today, if you take a united, organized, intentional approach, you will see results and you will get there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Hei-ock, and thank you to the panelists. That was like such an amazing conversation. I know in some of our early conversations, we knew we wanted to dedicate as much time as possible to this discussion. And I think a lot of the points that we got to today are really useful for not only people in global firms and global organizations, but small organizations as well. And there's a lot of information that people can take back and use in their own workplaces. And that was really, really the goal for today. So I really appreciate all four of you. And I'd like to give thanks from San Diego Green Building Council and myself. It's been really a pleasure to put this together and have this conversation. So I just want to thank you all again. And then to all of our attendees, again, we are recording today's session, so that'll be available on our website later on. Our Equity Summit is ongoing, so we have 2 more sessions. The next one will be starting in about 15 minutes at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's going to be about reimagining San Diego with climate and equity in mind. So we'll have panelists from the San Diego Urban Sustainability Coalition, the San Diego Green New Deal Alliance, City of San Diego Sustainability Department, a lot of great content to talk about here locally, what we're doing to address climate change with an equity lens. So I encourage you to join us for that next session. The links were in your reminder emails or in your confirmation emails. Share with your friends and colleagues, it's still free. And again, just thank you to everyone for joining us here today. It was a really great conversation, so appreciate it.
And thank you for hosting this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye everyone.
Bye.